If you're at all a fan of Sonic the Hedgehog, which considering statistics and general correlation and all that fun stuff, I'm assuming at least 50% of you are probably well aware that the Sonic fandom is a blistering, burning dumpster fire. Seriously, I have yet to meet a single Sonic fan that would disagree with that statement. And for very good reason. As this Reddit user beautifully summarized, the only real difference between now and the 2000s in terms of this fandom's quote-unquote etiquette is that our dumpster fire is mostly expressed in the toxic behavior way and not the cringy DeviantArt way anymore. And you know, even with all the craziness that runs rampant in the fandom, I get it. I really do. How many other franchises can say they've had a history and reputation as inconsistent and borderline necromantic as this one? If I was there in real time to see the blue blur flip-flop between some of the best and most varied games of the generation, and games that leave cuts so wide you're surprised the franchise hasn't bled out by now, seemingly at random, I'd probably be more than a little miffed for sure. But even still, Sonic continues trucking along no matter how bad or finance crippling the game may be. And we love him for it. You know, it's actually kind of inspiring to see Sonic stand strong after the many failures in its past. But at the same time, I genuinely want this franchise studied in laboratories because how the fuck did we bounce back from Rise of Lyric, y'all? With all this in mind, however, it's important to note that Sonic's extensive and turbulent history as a franchise does have consequences that go beyond the unhinged fandom. One of the biggest is the myriad of Mandela effects and urban legends that circle around the fandom. You see this a lot with memed phrases like Sonic was never good, or the many characterization debates that are nothing but misinformation on what's the accurate portrayal of a character. The chief of all these, however, is probably the phrase Sonic had a rough transition to 3D. A line that has been misconstrued and taken out of context so many times that it seems everybody who uses it fails to even understand what it really means. Luckily, you can count on me as the 100% never wrong, always objectively correct Sonic fan. Hey, doctors say that over 90% of people had a more positive outlook on Sonic the Hedgehog after watching my videos on the franchise. You can't argue with those statistics, can you? Yeah, I didn't think so. And by subscribing to the channel, which is free by the way, you too can be enlightened on the correct way to like Sonic the Hedgehog. Guys, please don't take me seriously. Please don't. Anyway, yeah, today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the rough transition phrase and talk about why supporters and detractors are right and wrong in different ways. Subscribe if you want to see more Sonic videos, cause I make a lot of them. Even though I don't consider myself a Sonic tuber because I refuse to be lumped in with that nonsense, are you kidding me?
Escucha las palabras de las brujas, los secretos escondidos en la noche.
When it comes to pinpointing the origins of this infamous phrase, it's a bit of a difficult little conundrum. Not only because a lot of the reviews for older Sonic games have simply been lost to the sands of time, but because it became so prevalent in reviews of Sonic games for a good chunk of the 2000s. According to Geek Critique, one of the earliest references to this rocky transition was a review of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle by GameSpot in 2002. Oh yeah, we're gonna be referencing Geek Critique a lot in this video because he spits straight facts about the Sonic franchise, so make sure to subscribe to him and go watch his videos. They're really well made. But I digress. As I said before, at a certain point in the 2000s, it seemed like this line was being used in every other review that involved a Sonic game. It didn't matter if the game was good or bad, classic or modern. Even in 2021, long after the franchise's supposed dark age, there were still references to Sonic's rough transition in the reviews for Colors Ultimate when it came out.
Sonic hasn't had the best time since
making the transition to 3D.
Now, I don't want to say this phrase is entirely without merit. I'll be getting into that later in the video. But I do think the way this morphed into the de facto way to summarize the franchise for any and all Sonic related reviews, and for such a long period of time, is kind of silly in the grand scheme of things. Not only is this an incredibly reductive take, but per a Mandela effect, it removes a lot of important context surrounding the franchise's history and the history of gaming in general. For now, let's focus on the three earliest 3D Sonic games, the adventure titles and Sonic Heroes, because these are the games where the phrase originated, and going any further starts to muddy the waters a bit. When you get right down to it, these games aren't that bad. Well, at least Adventure 1 and 2, I got some beef with Heroes. Especially when you consider that these were made in the early stages of 3D among the gaming industry. Of course, there's going to be camera issues and jank and all the typical growing pains of the era, and plenty of other 3D games released in a similar time period suffered from some of the same issues. If we're all gonna be intellectually honest with ourselves and look at these games for what they are, they're all mostly 5 to 8 out of 10 titles that lay a fine groundwork for potentially better games later down the line. Again, your mileage may vary on Sonic Heroes. I say all this because these 3 games were subject to a lot of unfair and straight up unhinged criticism back in the day, specifically in the mid to late 2000s and very early 2010s, where Sonic's identity as a laughingstock in the general public was very pronounced, and even the good games were apparently bad now. Take this review for example, and notice how overly dramatized it is. I was always a Sega kid. My fondest 16-bit memories are of games like Subterranea and Sonic the Hedgehog. I bought a Dreamcast on launch day, then a game, then yet another store still to buy a VMU. I bought Sonic Adventure a few days later, and I convinced myself that it was flawed but great. I was wrong. Sonic Adventure for XBLA and PSN has successfully driven a stake through the heart of my combined nostalgia / Dreamcast launch blinders / residual Sega fanboyism. Everything from the original releases in there, from fishing minigames to Chiao raising to awful voice acting, like an evidence folder in a trial against what you thought was obscenely the Dreamcast's flagship launch title. My god, why is this so damn funny? Sometimes I forget about the absolute hooligans that used to be writing these reviews, because what is this? And obviously, it would be one thing if this was just an isolated incident, a few bad apples spoiling the core if you will. But it seemed like everyone and their mother were getting a kick out of treating Sonic Adventure like it was the scum of the absolute earth. Sonic ran face first into a brick wall and he still hasn't been able to recover. Xbox 360 owners can now examine the black box of the crash that was Sonic Adventure. In short, I would not recommend Sonic Adventure to any of my friends, acquaintances, coworkers, enemies, or anyone else. A ding-dang slapdash title like this shouldn't be worth anyone's time or money. Y'all see what I mean? These people are menaces.
I left my 7-year-old daughter with Sam and Cat, and when I returned to pick her up, she was hungry, dirty, and missing a thumb. Sam and Cat forced my child to play with 9 poisonous snakes.
But then there's also the fact that Sonic Adventure 2 and especially Heroes were not spared from this blasphemy during Sonic's Dark Age. Like, damn, I feel like I owe Heroes an apology after seeing some of the stuff I read online. I don't exactly like the game, but you're telling me it was bad enough to deserve this abomination being written about it? Remember when the focus was Sonic? Well, screw that, now you can finally play as Cream the Rabbit in 3D! Or better yet, you can throw the game in the trash and be happy the consumer. Jesus Louises, my dude, who pissed in your Cheerios and forced you to eat it before you wrote this mess? And more importantly, why are you stepping on my goat Cream the Rabbit? I'm telling y'all, the best Sonic character gets no respect from these nobodies.
Stay real, stay loyal, or stay the hell away from me.
My main issue with the rough transition to 3D line is it implies that the Sonic franchise had become nothing but a hollow shell of its former self since it came to 3D. But there's so much more to the story than that. These aren't bad games on their own, at least not like some of the Dark Age backlash would have you believe. And sure, the fact that they weren't as well received compared to the Genesis games is part of the reason why they were considered a rough transition initially, but had the franchise properly used these games as frameworks for better and more polished titles later on, the roughness of these first few games would have just become irrelevant. Unfortunately, now we have to talk about why that didn't happen, and why the rough transition mantra was even allowed to take root. Even more tragically, we have to start by focusing on the early 3D titles again. For as much as I defended the adventure games and Heroes literally a few minutes ago, they unfortunately have a lot of problems. Problems that can't just be explained away by the early 3D jankiness. Especially Heroes. Look, I swear, I'm not a Heroes hater, but no holds are gonna be barred in the beatdown it's gonna get when I eventually review it, alright? Alright. Starting right out of the gate with Sonic Adventure 1, we make a very large departure from the core Sonic experience for at least 3/6 of the entire game. And even then, that's only if we're being generous and not counting Knuckles' treasure hunting, despite how detached it is from the speed and platforming of Sonic and Tails' campaigns. I've talked about this before on the channel, but the fact that all of these playstyles are so different from what the franchise had been known for up to that point practically guaranteed it a very divisive public record. And that's not even getting into the mixed quality of these other gameplay styles, which range from decently executed departures from the norm to fishing in a Sonic game. Look, I gotta side with the critics on this one. Regardless of how short Big's campaign is, even if it only has like 4 stages, the fact that a franchise that used to be known for rolling around at the speed of sound is asking us to go fishing is just ridiculous. And then we get to Sonic Adventure 2, which is somehow infinitely better and infinitely worse. I have a pretty old review of Sonic Adventure 2 on my channel. If you'd like to see more of my thoughts on the game, feel free to check it out. Just know that being my first video, it's a bit rougher than some of my newer stuff, and also, if I'm gonna be honest, I feel like I was a little too nice to the game's story in that review. You could cut out half the characters in the story and very little would change. The story's entire final act is a complete mess of contrivances and inconsistencies. The deuteragonist character that we're supposed to be focusing on the most gets shockingly little screen time in the grand scheme of things. Alright, I'm getting off topic and I'm being unnecessarily mean to Sonic Adventure 2. I still think the game is fine for what it is, really. It's just really interesting to me how it makes great improvements to its predecessor's formula in some ways, yet does things even worse in others. For example, despite all of the problems that come with such radically different playstyles in the same game, Sonic Adventure mitigates this somewhat by having all of the non-Sonic campaigns be shorter than his and stay relegated to their own storylines. If you just want to be blasting through levels as Sonic, that's all you're going to have to deal with for his entire run. Compare this to Sonic Adventure 2, and how, while it does cut down the number of playstyles to 3 and make sure to remove the more redundant and tedious playstyles in the process, the non-Sonic gameplay is now not only a required part of whichever story you decide to play, but also outnumbers the Sonic gameplay by a considerable margin. Now you have to play through a handful of inferior mech shooting and treasure hunting stages before you can get back to the content players are actually here for. Even the gameplay formulas themselves have been downgraded. While your mileage may vary on the more linear routing of the Sonic and Shadow stages compared to the more open-ended design in SA1, the treasure hunting levels evidently learned the wrong lessons from SA1 and decided to just cram you into areas that are either far too crowded or far too big, and give you a nerfed radar which only detects 1 emerald at a time to artificially increase the length of the stages. Meanwhile, the mech shooting level suddenly decided realism was an important detail to add to a Sonic game despite Gamma stages just 1 game prior working fine without it, and made the mech slow and stilted, with slower and clunkier level design to boot. Then we move on to Sonic Heroes, which throws out the adventure formula entirely to do something different once more. Again, to give credit where it's due, this new gameplay style at least still resembles the core Sonic experience from the Genesis era, and differences between characters are mostly kept to a minimum, so it doesn't run into the same issues that previous games did. The problem here is that the game is just not well designed at all. It's packed with glitches, jank, and game-breaking bugs like a stuffed turkey on Thanksgiving, especially if we factor in differences between consoles. It's honestly baffling to me that certain versions of the game have special stages that literally cannot be completed normally. I am not even joking, because the boost mode in the PC and Xbox versions of the special stages don't actually increase your speed, and if anything just slow you down, the only way to get all 7 Chaos Emeralds and by extension the true ending of Heroes is to either cheat or use exploits. And unlike the adventure games, Sonic Heroes doesn't even have the excuse of early 3D jank, since it came out 2 years after Sonic Adventure 2 and is still jankier than either of the adventure games were on the Dreamcast. If all that wasn't bad enough, because of the game's triple development cycle and the fact that there was only 1 level designer for the majority of it, the actual quality of the stages ends up being very mixed. Of course, it doesn't help that most of the levels are like 7 to 10 minutes long unless you're playing Team Rose, aka the best team of the entire game. I only speak truth, I fear. I haven't even gone into the game's other issues, like the poor boss fights even for Sonic standards and the requirement to play the game 4 separate times to unlock the final story. Needless to say, all of this comes together to make the game feel like an inconsistent mess. I really hope that none of this is coming across as overly mean. You guys are totally fine to have whatever opinion you'd like on these games. It's just important to remember that they are all very flawed in different ways, especially with how defensive the fandom can get over them. Just know that even with all the issues I mentioned, I continue to hold the belief that these are all mostly solid games with great potential for expansion and improvement. Problem is that improvement never actually happened, which in retrospect is the crux of the issue with Sonic as a franchise. Regardless of how exaggerated the rough 3D transition phrase might have become, one context in which I still believe its use is justified is the discussion around the failure of the later 3D Sonic games to meet the standards that the Sonic brand had set for itself back when it was at the top of its game. And my opinion is that this drop in quality is mostly due to the failures of Sega and to a lesser extent Sonic Team to capitalize on the merits of early 3D Sonic games and instead choosing to, if you'll pardon my comedic phrasing, invest in glorified clout chasing. To properly explain what I mean, I'm gonna have to get a little bit into ADHD mode and share some of the knowledge I've picked up from my many efforts to satiate my hyperfixations. Once again, I would like to credit Geek Critique for inspiring my interest in this topic, and I would definitely recommend his Sonic-related videos if you want a more in-depth perspective from someone who was actually there to witness the Sonic franchise's history and reception in real time. He explains what I'm about to go into far better than I ever could, and in general, I really appreciate the time and effort he puts into his videos. To start off, I'm gonna have to give you youngins a little history lesson. Some of this history, common knowledge, and some not so much. When Sonic first came out on the Genesis, he had quickly turned into a cultural phenomenon within the gaming community. Regardless of how slow, unengaging, and generally mediocre Sonic 1 might seem after all these decades, at the time it was an innovative platformer that brought new energy to the genre not seen very often beforehand. This positive reception only continued with Sonic 2 and 3, where Sega and Sonic Team took the foundation built by the first game and made many refinements along the way, leading to a sequel and a threequel that each managed to surpass its predecessor in quality. Do you people see what happens when you build upon a good foundation? Sonic 3 and Knuckles in particular is still regarded as one of the best games of the entire franchise to this day. And in general, the Genesis era was what cemented Sonic as a widespread gaming icon in the public eye, one that could go toe-to-toe with Mario, and in my personal opinion, come out on top. Hey, we didn't have phrases like Sega does what Nintendo don't for nothing, alright? Unfortunately, things with Sega as a publisher weren't going so well behind the scenes, especially after the 3 Genesis games. You see, the problem with Sega during the time was that, outside of the Genesis and arguably the Game Gear, the company had struggled with reaching any sort of success with console releases. And that had huge ripple effects for the Sonic games that came after the Genesis. The 32X, the Sega CD, the Master System, these were all consoles that underperformed or at the very least didn't share the widespread acclaim that the Genesis received. One console that deserves a special mention is the Sega Saturn, a console that primarily failed because of 2 reasons. One of which being the abundance of Japanese exclusive titles that had drastically lowered the game library in other regions, and the other being that the Sonic game which was supposed to be a launch title for it, Sonic Extreme, ultimately ended up being cancelled because of its hellish development cycle. By the time we get to the Dreamcast, it's been one failure after another for Sega, and they're pretty desperate to win back the crowd with this new console. What better way to do so than actually releasing a Sonic game as a launch title this time around, and making it the official first 3D Sonic game on the market. This idea eventually morphed into what we now know as Sonic Adventure 1. In order to capitalize on Sonic Adventure as a major selling point for the Dreamcast, the game was developed with several different gameplay styles in mind, sort of as a way to showcase how powerful and versatile the console could be. Look, we've got high-speed action. Look, we've got racing. We've got treasure hunting, mech shooting, stealth and puzzle solving, fishing that absolutely nobody asked for. Now go and buy us cause we've got all this cool stuff. Sonic Adventure 1 officially released on December of 1998, and while critic reviews for the game were actually quite positive, at least in the beginning, the true reception towards the game was decidedly more mixed than what one might believe. Some of you may have noticed that I neglected mentioning the reviews for the original game and instead focused on Adventure DX earlier in the video. The main reason for this is that even though the game's reviews were very good, I don't think those can be used as an accurate measure of the general consensus at the time, due to how much differently critics and game reviews in general were treated in the late 90s. There was a lot more bias that factored into reviews back then. For example, since the people who reviewed Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast probably 1. Liked Sega and Sonic enough to buy their games and consoles, and enough to write a review of them, and 2. Wanted to make a good impression on people who bought the Dreamcast, they were more likely to give the game a positive review. It's a similar story with Sonic Adventure 2, and partially why both of these games had noticeably lower scores once they were released on the GameCube. They were suddenly being exposed to an entirely different audience that didn't have the positive biases from before to persuade them, and in fact may have held some negative biases of the IP that was considered Nintendo's largest competitor at the time. I cannot repeat this enough, I don't think Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 are bad games at all. I don't think the critic reviews were necessarily fair, and I think that, for the time period, they were decently solid. But I absolutely agree with Geek Critique when he says that these were good games that needed to be great ones in the gaming landscape of the time. Think of all the popular franchises that were transitioning to 3D with massive success at the time. Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Crash Bandicoot, GTA. With all of these hard hitters going against Sonic Adventure and all of the flaws that it came with, the game just failed to deliver in comparison. All of this coming from the franchise that previously had a history of rivaling these other ones in quality. Well, what else can you call it but a rough transition to 3D? By the time 2001 rolled around, the Dreamcast was nearing the end of its lifespan. Despite Sega's efforts, it had ended up being yet another console that underperformed. And because of their many other failures up to this point, the company was in a bad place financially. Sega had very nearly gone bankrupt during this time. And if it wasn't for their president at the time gifting over $700 million from his company stocks before passing away from cancer, the Dreamcast would have likely been the final blow before they went under. After releasing Sonic Adventure 2, what could very well have been the last Sonic game ever made under different circumstances, Sega officially made the switch to third-party development and soon started work on the next 3D Sonic game, Sonic Heroes. As we have already established, the previous 2 3D Sonic games had a laundry list of complaints labeled against them, but generally they were still seen as a good starting point for Sonic's venture into 3D gaming if Sega could continue to improve upon the formula. Unfortunately, when Sonic Heroes rolled around, it became very clear that they were going to do the complete opposite of that. With this being the first cross-platform Sonic title to ever be worked on, the developers stated that they wanted to move away from the concepts of the adventure games in favor of making a more newcomer-friendly title. We can assume that this is why aspects such as the more lighthearted tone, simpler story, and very large cast of characters are all present here. This was going to be a lot of people's first ever introduction to the Sonic series, and they wanted it to be painted in the best light possible. It kinda wasn't, despite being one of the highest selling Sonic games. Reviews and reception were mixed right out of the gate. But this was yet another title that didn't reach the success of the Genesis games. But alas, Sonic kept trying. After Sonic Heroes, Sonic Team started development on the spin-off title Shadow the Hedgehog. And things were definitely taken in a very different direction. You guys remember when the dark and edgy titles like GTA 3 and Call of Duty were getting super popular in the gaming industry, right? I mean, I don't know why I'm asking this considering I wasn't even alive when either of these games released, and most of my audience is of people in my age range. But you know what, I just assumed past me decided that would be future me's problem when writing the script for this video. But anyway, it was games like these that started a trend of heavier and more mature titles being all the rage, and companies altering their more lighthearted properties to get with the program, as they say. Sonic was, once again, quick to shift gears at the literal drop of a hat, and overhauled the franchise to appeal to the most relevant trends of the time. Are we noticing a pattern here? The same thing happened again with Sonic 06. To be fair, this franchise revamp wasn't as egregious as Shadow, since the game surprisingly saw a return to the adventure formula that had laid vacant for years up to this point. But when you factor in the story, aesthetics, and general vibes of the game being this realistic, grim, fantastical drama, and then compare that to RPG stories like Final Fantasy hitting their golden age around the early 2000s, yeah, it's not hard to draw a correlation between the two, especially with how blatant it is. Again, do we sense a pattern yet? Then this happens again with Sonic Unleashed, and once again, to the game's credit, there's a little more to it than just blindly chasing trends. It did introduce the boost formula into the third dimension after its debut in Sonic Rush, and it definitely proved strong enough to remain a mainstay of the Sonic franchise even now. But considering the Werehog's combat-heavy beat-em-up gameplay, and how it bears a striking resemblance to the God of War games that had recently released, well, I think you guys get the idea. After the failure of the Dreamcast and Sega switched to third party, my theory is that they weren't confident enough in what they had previously built with the adventure formula, and were desperate to find another 3D gameplay style that could capture the same lightning in a bottle. And that's why throughout the 2000s, they keep flip-flopping between the drastic departure that was Heroes, the grimdark wannabe that is Shadow the Hedgehog, and the Final Fantasy and God of War knockoffs that were 06 and Unleashed. Sonic was constantly on a hunt for the hottest trends that he could capitalize on in the vain hope that something would stick. That something would prove to be the definite 3D experience, but in the end, it really just had the opposite effect. Most of the reviews for these games ranged from average to outright bad. And as we all know, one of the most common ways to refer to Sonic's nosedive in quality throughout the 2000s was that the franchise had a rough transition to 3D. Even the 2010s were inspired from this constant trend hopping, though it was toned down considerably. While Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations were good games that were actually able to build on a pre-established formula for the first time since Sonic Adventure 2, all of that was thrown away when Sonic released the game on the Wii U, where he was being the least Sonic possible. And in general, the Wii U being the newest console at the time led to Sega striking an exclusivity deal to release Sonic games only on that system, even though it came to the detriment of Rise of Lyric and ultimately made it yet another franchise-ending disaster when it was supposed to revive the franchise. The 2000s and 2010s are one and the same, I tell ya. The good news is that we seem to have landed on another popular viable formula with Sonic Frontiers and its open zone gameplay. Once again, we have a decent framework that could be used to release better games later on. The 2010s were able to make improvements to the boost formula for a little while, before they stopped, so I can only pray that the open zone formula does the same thing for good this time. With some of the rumors we've gotten about Frontiers 2, it seems our pleas have been answered, but I will remain cautiously optimistic until further notice. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching my videos. Feel free to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this stuff, and let me know your own personal thoughts in the comments below. Just please be civil, I'm begging. But without further ado, I bid you all adieu, which is basically fancy talk for have a great rest of your day or night.